Thank you, Gary. I really appreciate being here. My name is Dennis Hancock. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist at the University of Georgia. And if you want to follow along with some of the data that I'm going to be presenting here, I'm going to be presenting in kind of rapid fire format. You can scan this QR code, and that QR code was also on that survey, and you can take a look at it in more detail as I go along. I want to just take a moment to say last year I made a talk that on mob grazing that was probably one of the more controversial types of talks that I've ever done. I got more hate mail and more comments, nasty comments about that than anything I've ever done until today. Because I may upset a few folks here. And I thought this was going to be a home run. Whenever they asked me to do this, I said, give me something easy to talk about. How about talking about the benefits of clovers? That's easy to talk about. And then they tacked on, you need to talk about the limits. And so everything that Gary just talked about, I'm going to agree with if. Now, here lately, I've been taking on a little bit of an iffy appearance, and I think that's going to play over into my presentation. Some of you are going to have some questions about it, and by nature, I'm a skeptical person anyway, so you'll have to read into that as you go through that there's a fair amount of skepticism in some of my talking points here. But a lot of this is a review of the literature, and some of the literature that's out there is not as clear-cut, perhaps. There are some ifs that need to be considered as we go through. Well, let's just take a step back and talk about legumes in general. There's around 17,000 legume species out there that we have available to us, and now only about 150 of those do we actually utilize in any sense, and really only about 30 of those have any economic importance. If we look at, this was a survey, a review that was done by Phelan et al. Of all of the research that's been done on clovers. Unfortunately, I didn't find that publication until the very last one that I looked at, but if I'd done that, it'd saved me a lot of time, because one of the things that they looked at was the concentration of research articles about these different topics. Different species, and of course the number one species on that list of legumes was alfalfa, but white clover was right there behind it, and really they itemized 5 of being of the most worldwide importance, including alfalfa, white clover, red clover, bird's foot trefoil, and subterranean clover, which is a whole lot more important, particularly in Australia and to some degree in New Zealand as well, and parts of the U.S. too. And then they also looked at these as to whether or not they were related to hay production or grazing or silage. And so looking at the frequency of the publications on those particular subjects. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and seeing alfalfa very much a hay focus, but the others being a lot more of a grazing focus. And that's why we're going to spend a lot more time here talking about red clover, white clover, and bird's foot trefoil. Just to kind of go through some of the science here of how the nitrogen symbiosis relationship there works, and the sharing of that nitrogen between clovers and grass. We can see that the atmospheric nitrogen here is being converted into ammonium and taken up by the clover, but it's also, some of it's quite leaky. And there are a number of mechanisms by which that leakiness occurs, one of which is through mycorrhiza hyphae connections, which we have discovered over the past few years actually literally connect the clover plant with the grass plant by roots. And so there's a little bit that is transferred by that way. Now that's really a very minor contribution overall, but it is one that's of significance. The decay of plant tissues, the sloughed off leaves and roots and whatnot that are there, the decay of that is also a prominent role, but it's really secondary to the exudates coming out of the roots. Now the roots are quite leaky. There's a little bit of ammonium that's coming out of those roots, but there's also a fair amount of amino acids that are coming out of those roots as well. Actually a considerable amount coming out as amino acids, and those are converted to ammonium and then taken up by the plant. But also there's some recent research to suggest that there may actually be some direct absorption of some of those amino acids, which I found kind of interesting and novel. Of course, if we put nitrogen fertilizer out there, both plants are going to benefit. These legumes are kind of lazy. If they don't have to make nitrogen, they're not going to make nitrogen. So if it's available, they're not going to utilize the atmospheric nitrogen. They're going to utilize the existing soil nitrogen that's there in the soil. Just to kind of summarize some of the things that we all kind of know about nitrogen fixation in clovers and how this really fits in. One of the first points I want to point out is that nitrogen fixation is directly proportional to legume yield. If your legumes are in your pasture and you got little Dutch white clover out in your pasture that's not really yielding very much, you're not getting much nitrogen out of it. All right? So many of you, I'm sure, realize this, but there's a lot of folks that I encounter, we go out and walk out in their pastures and they say, I don't want to kill that white clover. There's not much white clover out there. It's all Dutch white clover and it's about 2 inches tall and that's it. There's not enough yield out there to really make much of a difference. The second thing I want to say is that the grass clover mixtures that fixes, let's say, X amount of nitrogen can equal the yields of grass fertilized with X amount of nitrogen. Okay, so we can actually see the equivalent. The plant makes no distinguishment between the nitrogen fixation or that nitrogen coming out of a bag, as long as the clover doesn't compete too much with the grass. For example, down in my country in Georgia, Bermuda grass is king, and if that Bermuda grass is being shaded out by anything, including any clover that might be growing over the top of it, that can be a yield limiting factor. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a moment. The distribution of forage from grass and clover may be actually different than the grass plus nitrogen. It may actually push it more into the spring or early summer, for example. That could be a very good thing. It also can be a challenge if we're talking about warm season species, because some of those that's when they're most actively growing, is going to be in May and June. Of course, the comments of the quality benefits of clovers, outstanding, absolutely true, and especially with regard to protein, there's a major improvement there. But of course, that also applies to digestible energy. In most of our situations in the humid East, energy, digestible dry matter, is the most limiting value that we're dealing with here. Now, if we're talking about maintaining a dry beef cow, we can do that with pretty much anything. But if we're trying to get that animal bred back, if we're trying to get that animal to lactate, if we're trying to get that animal to gain weight, we're going to have to look at some of these options, for example, legumes and cool season grasses, to be able to provide that kind of quality. One of the main reasons for growing clover is growing it with tall fescue, especially endophyte infected tall fescue. And the data is absolutely clear there that we can integrate clovers with that endophyte infected tall fescue and see an improvement, just as Gary was talking about earlier. But I'm going to suggest to you that this dilution effect, or so-called dilution effect, isn't always just a straight up dilution effect. There's still some toxin load there, Glenn. Wouldn't you agree? There's still some toxin getting into those animals. And if we're not careful, we may think that we're solving the problem with clovers, when in reality, there's still something going on with those animals. Now, here's some of the classic work that's been done on clovers. And this is Roy Blazer's work and colleagues there at Virginia Tech back in the 50s. And one of the studies have been frequently cited over the years. And if you look at average daily gain, for example, there is clearly an advantage of having the clover in on top of the fescue. Now, I put a question mark there beside the endophyte infection level of that fescue. Back then, they didn't really know about that, and so it wasn't clear whether or not that is a toxic tall fescue, but we can probably safely assume it probably was. And if we look at the orchard grass and addition of clover there, we do see an improvement in average daily gain. Now, if we look at a more recent study, and this is some work, I saw John Andre yesterday. Is John in the room? Well, you can ask him about this later on. This is some work that he did when he was still at the University of Georgia. Nick Hill and Joe Boughton were involved with this study as well. And they got a very similar kind of response there with endophyte infected tall fescue. And when they added the white clover, they got the added benefit of the clover. But if they had just straight novel endophyte tall fescue, they got actually more performance out of that. And then if they added clover on top of that, they got even greater benefit. It was a synergistic effect, not just an additive effect. Okay, there's a great benefit from adding that clover to any tall fescue, not just the endophyte infected tall fescue. However, what I want to point out is that dilution is not really the solution here. There may still be getting a toxic dose there, and therein lies that synergistic effect that we're seeing from that clover addition to the novel endophyte. Furthermore, if we go back to this study from Virginia, and we look at the other part of this, which is grazing days and grazing the gain per acre here. When we look at this, I think we need to get a little bit of a pause here, thinking about our performance. Our overall gain per acre was actually highest on the fescue with the nitrogen. All right, there was some statistical differences there, and that can translate to some significant dollars on the table. Now, not all of the studies are that way. This is a study from Washington that was irrigated, and they saw an increase in both years that they did this study on both orchard grass and tall fescue, so there's a great benefit there. But in Minnesota, when they did this with the same scenario, this case I think it was orchard grass that they were using, 12% greater milk actually on the grass plus nitrogen. Clark did it in Maryland at about the same time and found that there was an advantage for the grass and the clover over 3 years. But at year 3, this is a crucial point, and we'll come back to that. In year 3, grass plus nitrogen was greater. What's going on there? Clover is playing out. So one of the ifs is persistence. So if we look at average daily gain here, there's consistently a benefit for the clover. Okay, the dotted lines or the dashed lines here represent the clover companion to each grass, and it consistently was greater. But when we looked at the stocking rates between the two species, or the 4 combinations here, there was greater stocking rates actually with the grass plus nitrogen only. And that's what translated to greater productivity on a per acre basis as a result. If we go back and look at a lot of the old literature, and Joe Burns, who was an ARS research scientist in Raleigh, North Carolina, partnered with an ag economist there from NC State in 1985 as part of a trilateral symposium and workshop that they held in New Zealand with Australia, New Zealand, and the US. Basically what they found is in 42 experiments where they had average daily gain data, there was a 90% of those actually reported an advantage for the grass plus clover in terms of average daily gain. An average increase in that average daily gain was 18%. So that's a very significant number. Very important thing to consider. Now, only 38 of those studies actually reported production per acre. And the mean increase in production per acre there also happened to be 18% increase. But if we look at all of those studies, only 50% of those actually showed a real or significant increase. 27% showed no difference, and 23% showed a decrease. And many of these that are showing those decreased productions were actually in areas dominated by warm season grass species. Okay? So, one of the real issues that kind of came to light as I was reviewing a lot of that research, though, is that usually it was year 3 that was holding down the averages here for production per acre. And the reason being is, I think, persistence of those clovers is an issue. I think one of the more important issues that we talk about here is persistence. Let me give you an example of that. This is some Georgia work. This is toxic tall fescue with nitrogen and standard low performance there. If we had toxic tall fescue plus regal white clover, we actually increased it, but our gain per acre decreased. But yet if we have a variety that is known for being very persistent, one that performs extremely well in our environment in Georgia, for example, Durana, lasts at least 3 years for us, we actually did see that not only average daily gain improvement, but also the gain per acre there was improved there. So persistence is absolutely the key. So that's one of the more important ifs to the statement about clover. So forage persistence is that major limit. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that animals prefer to graze clovers. Particularly ruminant animals, they love grazing clovers. If given the choice, they will consume a diet that's about 70% clover. Now think about that. If you've got a 20% stand in your, let's make the numbers round. Let's say it's 75%. If you've got a 25% stand of clover in your pasture, that means they're going to eat 3 times as much of that clover, if possible, compared to the grass. The point is that they're going to put extra pressure on the clover. And if we're not careful with our grazing management, we can graze that clover out. The second factor, of course, is all the other cadre of management factors, and the most important one on this list, in my opinion, is broadleaf weed management. We're going to talk more about that at length later on. But nitrogen fertilization, manure application with the nitrogen that comes along with that, grazing management, also very crucial, and rotational grazing is going to give it an advantage, to give it a rest. Even hoof damage. We think of white clover as being something that's very tolerant to hoof damage, but actually, as it turns out, all of them are, including white clover, damaged by hooves. The third thing I want to point out, and this is quite controversial, particularly those in the seed industry, is that seed yield and persistence are inversely related. All right? Now think about this from a standpoint of a seed grower out in Oregon, for example. Their number one priority is to get as many pounds of clover seed off of a given acre as they possibly can. But your priority as a producer, as a buyer of that seed, you want that seed to last as long as you possibly can. And those things are in conflict with one another. So we have to be growing varieties that absolutely have very good persistence, but also have good seed yields as well. Now, there's some thought that from an evolutionary standpoint, these legumes would colonize low nitrogen areas, soils that were low in nitrogen, and then over time it would give an advantage to the grass. And so there was a coexistence of those, and they would naturally oscillate from one another. Okay, in New Zealand they talk about this clover oscillation, and about every 3 to 4 years they see a dip in a valley, you know. And actually, if we look at some of that data from New Zealand, here is the solid line is with nitrogen, the dotted line here is with no nitrogen but with clover. And if we look at the clover in those pastures, we get this zigzag motion. Some years it's pretty good, and some other years it's not. But the actual performance was relatively stable across that 5-year span. My point is that it builds up the nitrogen, the clovers kind of back away and the grasses take over, and as the grasses slow down, the clovers come back again. Now let's do a little bit of math on the economics here. And I'm going to throw a lot at you really fast, and I apologize so much on one slide, but just bear with me. I'm going to step you through this. And if you're interested, you can go to this little link right here, and you can pull up the spreadsheet that I'm going to be talking about. Okay? So you can put in your own numbers and come up with your own information here. But the way I figured is based on our recommendations, our clover establishment budget would be roughly about $157 per acre. The cost of maintaining a grass plus clover pasture, outside of the cost of establishment, the cost of maintaining it is roughly about $106 per acre. That's no nitrogen, $106 per acre for all your other variable costs. All right? Now, if that clover stand only lasts 1 year, that $157 is actually going to cost us $168.78 because we got to pay the banker. He's got to get his part, right? If we get that to last 2 to 3 years, if we get it to last 3 years, we can get that cost down to an annual establishment cost of about $60. That's much more cost effective and much more opportunity there to work with. It also depends upon the price of nitrogen. If nitrogen is cheap, we're probably going to have to make this last a lot longer. But if nitrogen is back the way it was 3 or 4 years ago, up above 80 cents, we have a lot more cost there that we have to consider. Okay? So if we look at these individual scenarios, basically the bottom line is right now we're looking at prices of about 45 to 50 cents per pound of nitrogen. Right now, if we can't get 3 years worth of persistence out of that clover, it's not economical, all right, roughly. And that's before we account for any differences in performance, all right? Now, if the performance is improved, those numbers become a little bit more green. But if the performance is decreased, then we're going to have to get more nitrogen bang for our buck, so to speak. Now, this is particularly true when we start dealing with warm season grass-based pastures, which is the world I live in mostly. We do have some tall fescue in North Georgia, but primarily we're dealing with Bermuda grass dominant pastures. This is some interesting work that Monty Roquette and company there at Texas A&M did over a long term. Monty, this was what, 30 years worth of data altogether? Where did Monty go? I saw him earlier. Yes, okay. Good long study there. Excellent research, and I highly recommend you taking a look at it. It's in the Professional Animal Scientist Journal. Basically what it's saying is here that as stocking rate increased, the ability of the grass clover to keep up with the grass nitrogen went away. The advantage really was the grass plus nitrogen, much more pronounced in those warm season grass pastures, particularly with regard to average daily gain, but on the stocking rate, particularly there was an advantage for the grass plus nitrogen. So there's a real advantage there to the grass plus nitrogen, but is this made up for by low cost? Certainly in this situation, they were not putting on any nitrogen. Correct, Monty? You all weren't putting on any nitrogen on that study, on the clover, compared to the grass only where they did put nitrogen on. So is there an advantage there for the cost, on the cost side? Well, let's look at this, and I've pulled data out of 2 of their publications to kind of pull all this together. And here's the stocking rate, so we know how many cows that we're running on a per acre basis and the gain per acre that we're looking at. The gross income that we're looking at, if we assume here, I think I've got it on the next one, yeah, $130 a hundredweight, so $1.30 a pound. The gross income here, you can see the lines there. There's an advantage for the nitrogen, but what about pasture cost? Yes, there is more of a pasture cost there associated with that, and that's looking at current prices and using our recommendations in the state of Georgia. Your results will vary, but that's a fairly good representation of what our costs were going to be. And if we multiply the stocking rate, the cow cost, by 325, which is a pretty typical number for non-pasture related cost for cow cost, we find that the returns over variable cost here give an advantage for the grass plus legume system. Now, there's a few economists in the room. I saw Dr. Pravat, or Mr. Pravat, back there somewhere earlier on, and he may cringe a little bit at my methodology. But again, what I would say is that I think we really need to take a look at the economics behind these at current prices. And we can model various scenarios and see that that may change around. I'm not alone in that. I feel confident in the fact that I'm not the only one that's kind of raising some of these questions. Twain Butler, who is certainly a fan of clovers as well, out at the Noble Research Institute a few years ago, published this paper questioning the same idea here about the high cost of establishment, the lower gains, and the fewer grazing days driving up the cost and forming less net return per acre. Similar results also from Noble Research Institute there, looking at clover and alfalfa instead of nitrogen, and again saw an advantage for Bermuda grass plus nitrogen. What other ways might we be able to integrate this in? What about creep grazing of these legumes into the system? And particularly down in our neck of the woods, this has been tried quite often. Vanessa Corrier did this work in Georgia for her PhD, where she was looking at creep grazing alfalfa. She also looked at ashenominy and basically found that, yeah, it did improve the cow weight gain, but it didn't really make a difference in production per acre. Jamie Foster down in Florida looked at creep grazing cowpea or annual peanut in Bahia grass pastures. And one year she saw an advantage and another year she didn't. Wet year she saw really more of an advantage for the grass. In the dry year it was more of an advantage for the clover. Joe Vendramini, who's here today, also looked at doing a similar kind of scenario with creep grazing cowpea and Bahia grass. So I think one really has to think about how the profitabilities might work out. And granted, in this system, you're only putting those legumes in a small area, so your cost of establishment is going to be considerably less, but also the impact of those clovers over the whole system is probably going to be less as well. Finally, I want to just spend a moment talking about some of the risks with regard to the environment and how we may have an impact on the environment with using nitrogen instead of clovers or vice versa. And this is particularly apparent when we did our tour down in New Zealand. I saw Bill Payne here earlier. And Min is there as well. We took a trip. There was about 20 of us last year or year before last now, that went down to New Zealand. And here's at the North Island. This is right at the edge of Lake Taupo, a beautiful location, and they're very concerned about high nitrates making their way into the water system there and destroying the serene look that you see there. And so they've spent a lot of money and input into looking at the effect of nitrogen and whatever the source. And basically what they found is that regardless of that source, it's a function of how much nitrogen is going into the system. In other words, 300 pounds of nitrogen from a bag had just as much nitrate leaching as 300 pounds of nitrogen fixed from the clover. Okay? That was a surprise to me. I didn't expect that actually to occur. Also some work from Texas where they were looking at phosphorus. And in my mind, just to kind of greatly simplify this particular study, this is really more of a function of stocking rate than it is more about the grazing system of clover versus no clover. It is interesting. I find that this, you see some differences compared to the initial values here, especially after such a long period of time, all the way down through the soil profile. But really, there are some significant differences there between them, but it's a flip-flop from the low stocking rate to the high stocking rate. So if we're really pushing it, we're going to see a difference there. But what about greenhouse gas emissions? That's a biggie, right? That's a very important consideration, is greenhouse gas emissions. Energy use for that kind of system where we're putting out no nitrogen commercially, but we're getting it all from clover, the energy use of that system is roughly half of where we are using commercial fertilizer, commercial nitrogen. And in a situation where we're kind of supplementing the clover nitrogen fertilization by giving a little boost with commercial nitrogen, we're seeing, again, a significant amount of energy use per kilogram of milk. The greenhouse gas emissions, there are some slight differences and slight advantage there for clover on a per kilogram of milk basis. But when we adjust this for differences in carrying capacity, do those actually go away? Is there really an advantage for the clover in that kind of system? The work really hasn't been done on that. I think there really needs to be more work done on looking at the comparison of these clover systems at productivity per acre and the carbon footprint across that. I think it's also instructive to look at water usage, and Lisa Baxter and her PhD work at Texas Tech looked at animal performance and water usage, and they found that the average daily gain was increased by 38% in grass legume systems over grass only, and the gain per acre was increased pretty substantially. Comparing old world blue stem to alfalfa and tall wheatgrass, I think there's a definite advantage there from the high protein nature of that alfalfa. But it also is a heavy user of water. But the bottom line is because it was so much more productive on a per acre basis, in this case, there's an argument that could be made that actually the grass legume is much better in that scenario to be able to utilize that acre of land or that hectare of land much more efficiently. There are a few other issues that I think we need to talk about and address, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on bloat because a lot of folks do understand bloat, and to quote Dr. Don Ball, and I use this quote often, there has been more money lost out of the fear of bloat than there ever was lost on actual bloat. And even this slide, Gary, I think I was actually there the day that this picture was taken. This was when I was a summer intern with Dr. Lacefield. Those aren't bloated animals. Those actually were killed by lightning strike. But there are some preventative things that we do need to be thinking about if we're going to use clovers. And one is that we don't need to turn them out there hungry. That is a recipe for disaster. Provide some mixed forages, grass and legumes, going to highly offset that risk. Using something like Monensis is a big advantage there too, and can greatly reduce the risk of bloat. And then of course using proloxaline, which is bloat guard, the preventative addition to the mineral to actually help that situation too. Another one that we don't really talk about much, and I think is important, particularly if we're talking about red clover. And of the legumes, I think red clover is the most underutilized legume that we have. I think that's one of the most important ones, but we don't use it enough. But one of the concerns that we do have with red clover is the high levels of isoflavones that actually mimic estrogen in the animal. And this can have some consequences from a reproductive standpoint. From a stock or cattle production, this could actually be greatly beneficial. But from a reproductive standpoint, particularly those that are in red, those are high in red clover. Coumestrol can actually be high in alfalfa if that alfalfa is overly mature or stressed through disease or otherwise. This can lead to infertility, lack of ovulation, and estrus in those animals, so definitely can be a challenge. There's also some recent data to suggest that particularly clover, red clover-based pastures where dairy cattle are grazing those, the levels of those hormones, those phytoestrogens showing up in the milk are about 2 to 10 times greater than the typical concentration. The impact that that has on human health is still very much an open book. We do not know what that implication might be, but definitely there is an increase, and so we need to kind of challenge that and look at that. So just in summary, integrating clover into cool season grass-based pastures more than likely is going to be a home run if you can get it to last for a good long time. I think one of the big points I want to point out, though, is your results may vary. If you have an area that is more challenged from persistence and your establishment costs are going to be higher, then it may or may not be as profitable as we sometimes talk about. Particularly for those areas with poor soils, low fertility, especially low pH, we may have some challenges there. Frequent drought susceptibility may all lead to decreases in production. In warm season grass-based pastures where no additional nitrogen is being added at all, I think that's kind of a recipe for a real challenge, because although it's likely to increase individual animal production, but not always, it's very likely to cause a decrease in overall animal production per acre. And again, your results may vary. Things like alfalfa in Bermuda grass, we've been finding that to work extremely well. White clover in Bermuda grass is a bit more of a challenge, making that really pencil out in our more challenging environment. What about if we use that clover, but we do give it a little bit of nitrogen, we just credit that nitrogen we're getting from the clover, especially winter annual clover. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this area. It is likely to, unlikely to increase animal production necessarily, and your gains per acre are probably going to be about the same as grass plus nitrogen. But again, your results may vary, particularly with different species and the price of nitrogen. So as nitrogen prices go back up again, it may be more advantageous. But your choice of legume is highly crucial here, particularly getting a good long stand life out of it and something that's going to yield really well. It has to yield really well to make this really pencil out. So with that, I'm going to stop. I know we have another speaker coming up, and I think we may need to hold questions to the very end because I probably have gone a little bit over time. But let's go ahead and transition now. Pat, I think you're up next.
Big round of applause for Dennis. We have